Hey there, I'm Mark from Spectrum Pulse, and today we have from Zach Bryan, the great American bar scene. I think at this point my opinions on Zach Bryan have largely stabilized. When you've reviewed someone 5 times in less than 5 years and he's easily put out enough material to support that, well, it'll happen. I like his eye for texture and raw songwriting, and more often than not you'll get pure nuggets of Americana gold on every project, but structures of said projects that can be kind of frustrating, as the editing and production can be a bit slipshod and often leave me preferring his tighter and more focused EPs to the full-length albums. But there was something about the run-up to the Great American Bar Scene that felt different. The lead-off singles were the most warm and varied in the texture that they've ever been, and you could tell Zach Bryan was trying to push his songwriting into more interesting, conceptual storytelling while maintaining his usual formula and blithely ignoring any mainstream concessions. Now, for Zach Bryan to maintain the sort of sonic integrity he has for a sound that sure as hell is not Music Row commercially polished, which he's now actively denigrating, and then see tremendous crossover success for it, including taking an act scorned by Nashville like Casey Musgraves to the #1, that is damn near unprecedented, and honestly gave me a little bit of faith that something more ambitious could land pretty well, and thus, you know what? For the most part, it absolutely does. Discounting the EPs, this is probably the most I have liked a Zach Bryan album as a whole, even despite his known issues by this point. Mostly because said issues feel somewhat diminished with the more refined framework. Well, okay, slightly more diminished. The truism that Zach Bryan's albums are just way too long, could probably use an editor, that's in force. And for an album that is largely mid-tempo, where his louder delivery can almost feel a bit out of place on a couple songs, like on the hook of Northern Thunder, I will say momentum's an open question, or let's put it another way, John Mayer does not add enough to Better Days to justify that song's inclusion on the album, and there are a couple deep cuts around it that could have been trimmed to a tighter package. But to Zach Bryan's credit, the production feels more refined and intentional and organic this time around, where the rougher pickups have the benefit of feeling better blended with more diegetic sound and atmosphere being allowed to flesh out that mix, with the best example being how the pool balls rattle at the perfect time on the title track. If you're trying to set the scene of the bar band that's playing amidst the crowd, this would be how you do it. And thus, I am a little bit more forgiving of some of the inconsistencies. That happens across the bars of America if you're trying to play. Of course, some of this is just Zach Bryan becoming a better producer with time, and the warmth in which he gives the harmonica blast on the title track and Boons and Pink Skies, or just how fantastic the fiddle sounds on 28, probably the closest he will ever come to sounding like Jason Isbell, and for me that's a compliment. Or that trumpet on Oak Island, or the pedal steel on Like Ida, or the soulful choirs on Towers, that's an experiment I think really worked. Or just the acoustics as a whole, be they more ramshackle on Mechanical Bull, or significantly cleaner on Memphis the Blues with John Moreland, where I actually really like the guitar and vocal interplay. But this will take us to the said guest stars, and I've already talked on Billboard Breakdown about how I really like Nolene Hoffman on Purple Gas, even if I'm a bit cooler on the song as a whole, especially in the context of the album. But the big standout is the boss, Bruce Springsteen himself on Sandpaper. Yes, the groove is liberally being borrowed from I'm on Fire, and there's a part of me that thinks that Chinatown by Bleachers is still probably the best modern Springsteen collab, but the central metaphor really works, and they actually got some chemistry. We'll come back to that in a second, but let's talk content, because the storytelling of this album is vividly detailed, but more abstract and potential meaning, if there's meaning at all. The impression I get from Zach Bryan's writing nowadays after newfound fame and success is that he actually has fewer answers than he ever has before. He's getting older and already wondering if he's getting left behind, or whether that's even a bad thing. He's still grappling with the loss of his mother, and to go by Bass Boat, some rather complicated feelings beyond grief he's only now unpacking, and also his own depression, egged on by alcohol abuse. The feeling that he was still supposed to be an enlisted man, man with a deep pang of survivor's guilt in the success that he has now found. There's a lot of references to the reality of being in the military, especially post-discharge on this album, and as someone who once had some proximity near the scene to learn enough, those cut surprisingly deep for me. And thus, there's actually a lot more anger and violence at the forefront of these stories. The great American bar scene has more than a few bar fights, as folks attempt to scrabble out their answers and meaning where the morals might be left at the door. The turnaround on Oak Island is particularly brutal, and while Zach Bryan showcases a shocking amount of hope that things might get better, or at least we can savor the better days right now for where they are, it's also why Sandpaper is so effective. At least for a time, he's trying to get away from the person who, like Sandpaper, wears down his rough edges but might also bind him. It's not that he's averse to that connection or changing. He's seen the casualties of the scene, the way back, Oak Island. They're brutal in highlighting those who might stumble off the rails. But there is something about clinging to the mess right now and not assuming that he's got all the path figured out that's got a more weathered, more mature emotional resonance. How very Springsteen of him. But in short, you know what, if you came for the barn burners or his crossover ballads, this album might actually be a tougher sell. The sound is drenched in a richer Americana, but the writing brings out a deeper bruise, and while for some it's a tougher sit, for me, I think it's probably his best album. I'm still on the fence whether or not it's his best project. Summertime Blues and Boys of Faith set a really high bar, but if you're looking for Zach Bryan to refine his sound, yeah, devil might be in the details. And probably also at the bottom of the bottle. This is a one you're going to want to drink through. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you want to see more, please be sure to like, share, drop comments, subscribe, especially longtime Zach Bryan fans. I'm curious where y'all are falling on this, given that, again, I think it's going to be a slightly more difficult album compared to American Heartbreak or the self-titled, or even like Deanne or other albums from earlier on. I'm curious where y'all fall on it. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if y'all want to get involved in helping support the channel, my option in my Patreon is right over there, where you can get albums onto my schedule or even argue with me on my Discord more directly. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.